Eva Martin, and I am the lead attorney from the firm of Martin & Martin, representing the survivors and descendants of Section 14. So honored to have joining me this morning survivors, their family members, descendants, distinguished community leaders from Los Angeles, elected officials, and faith leaders. Today is a really significant day for these families, for their descendants. Many of you know Palm Springs to be an exotic resort location in the desert, a place that is the playground for the rich and famous, the ultra wealthy, the Hollywood elites. But as Palm Springs was developing into this exotic playground, this place that many call their vacation home, it was keeping a very, very dark secret. And that secret is called Section 14. And today we are here to amplify the voices of the victims of Section 14. On behalf of those victims, the survivors, the descendants, my firm this morning filed an amended claim form, government tort claim form, with the city of Palm Springs, laying out in great detail the atrocities that these families, their survivors, suffered at the hands of the city council, the mayor, and the city of Palm Springs. This story has been mainly confined to Palm Springs. And if you live in Palm Springs, you've heard of Section 14. If you've visited Palm Springs, you've driven through Section 14. It is this prime piece of property in downtown Palm Springs, 1 acre, 641 square miles, 646 acres of prime downtown property. And this was a thriving working class community of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other minorities. And these individuals didn't set out to live on Section 14, but because of racially restrictive covenants, discriminatory housing practices that were pervasive in Palm Springs and really throughout the state of California during the 1950s and 60s, this is where these families found themselves. But like so many other minorities, minoritized populations, they turned this 1 square mile into a thriving community, a community that had churches and businesses, where neighbors played with each other, where kids got to know each other, where blacks and browns lived next door to each other, and where they created a place they called home. The city had other plans for this property, and as federal laws changed and made this property that was owned by the tribal community more conducive to commercial development, commercial rent, to commercial enterprises, the city hatched a plan. And the plan wasn't to use the legal process to have these families relocated. The plan wasn't to provide them with housing relocation or to provide them with financial assistance. The plan was to use fear and intimidation, to bulldoze and to burn down these families, to burn their homes, in many cases with their personal belongings still inside. So just imagine you're a little kid coming home from school to this neighborhood that you love, to the neighbors that you love, and you see your house on fire. And you can't call City Hall, you can't call your city council person, you can't even call your city fire department. That's because it was your city fire department, not an arsonist, but the city fire department that was setting the fires, that was literally burning down your house. And someone asked me, well, how come the city didn't use eminent domain? How come they didn't use a legal eviction process? I don't have the answers to that. I can tell you there's no evidence that they did that they did use any legal process to remove these families. We do know that they were driven by greed, and they used their positions. They acted under the color of law to perpetrate the most cruel, the most unjust upending of a community that we've ever seen in the state of California. We've heard of Tulsa, Oklahoma, we've heard of Rosewood, Florida, we've even heard of Bruce's Beach. And it's our belief that the story of Section 14 is similar to, akin to, and that's why we are elevating this story beyond Palm Springs, because we think it has implications beyond that city. It's a story that this state should be talking about. It's a story that this nation should be talking about. Now, Palm Springs issued an apology to these families about 14 months ago. It acknowledged the atrocities. It acknowledged the racially motivated attacks that are laid out and documented in an Attorney General's report. The Attorney General came into Palm Springs in the 1960s and documented these atrocities, called what happened in Palm Springs a city-engineered Holocaust. And that's why Senator Bradford is here, because the actions of the city of Palm Springs, its then mayor, Frank Bogart, involved the state of California. So the city, 14 months ago, issued an apology, but nothing has happened since then. There's been no actions to make these families whole. There's been no actions to engage with them, to provide a process that would compensate them for the racial trauma that they experienced, the financial losses that they experienced, and the harms that they have suffered. And we are here today to say we've waited 60 years. We can't wait another decade. We can't wait another month. We can't wait another day to make these families whole. So we're calling on Palm Springs to come to the table, to do the right thing, to compensate these families, to make them whole, to give them the restorative justice that they so richly deserve. So again, I want to thank all of you for joining me this morning. We're going to hear some of the stories, the harrowing stories of survivors. I want to start with Pearl Devers. Pearl was just a little girl when her family's home was burned in Section 14.
Good morning. Thank you, Ariva. My story. I was born and raised in the city of Palm Springs. I was born in a hospital that my father, who was a skilled laborer, he was a carpenter, he built our home from scratch. He also helped other families in the neighborhood build their home. Being born and raised in Palm Springs was really special, especially as a child. The community where I was born and raised was a safe haven for me and my family. I lived in Section 14 with my mother, my father, and 4 siblings. The neighborhood of Palm Springs was a fun place to grow up and live. It was a neighborhood where your neighbors knew you, they took care of you. It was the real, it takes a village type of living, because that's what we did. We took care of one another. We played in the streets till dawn, until dark, and we ate at each other's homes. Didn't matter if you were Black, Mexican, or whatever, we all were like family. And to this very day, we still have lifelong relationships. That's the type of community that we grew up in. And it was just beautiful. We went to church, we went to school, but mostly I just remember loving to play. Remember my father, the home that he built for us as a young girl. I used to love clothes. My brothers, I had to share a closet with my brothers. And my father, being the skilled laborer that he was, got tired of me crying and complaining about my clothes being thrown around. And it was really special to me to have my daddy build me a special closet in that house. And I just felt so honored to have that. My daddy was my hero. He was a community spokesperson. He helped started the first chapter of the NAACP there in the city of Palm Springs. My daddy was everything to me. And my family and my community was everything to me. One day, my mom began to pack up things, and the next thing I knew, my mom, my two brothers, my two older siblings had moved on. One went to the military, the other one got married. But it was myself and my two brothers. We ended up leaving our home. Just seemed like to me out of the blue. Well, not only did we leave our home, we left my precious daddy behind. My daddy was one that was going to stick it out. I had no idea why we were leaving as a child. But I later found out that we were forced out of our home. We moved in with a friend not too far from where we lived in Section 14. We stayed there, and it just seemed like from time to time we would move from one home in Section 14 to another. We must have lived in about 5 different locations in Section 14. Again, as a child, I'm not knowing what's going on. All I know is that my daddy was no longer with us and that we were not in our home. I later found out that my daddy began to drink, and my father succumbed to alcoholism. This took him out. He was a man that was used to taking care of his family. He was a man that was used to not only taking care of his family, but being a spokesperson in the community. My mother said, I never thought that this would take him out. My father never recovered from his alcoholism. Back then, we didn't know of AA. We didn't know of any treatment. It was horrifying for me as a child, not only to go back to that neighborhood, even before we left, we saw homes burning around us, smell of the smoke, clueless as a kid. But when I look back and when I think about it, it just breaks my heart. My family was split, a lot of emotional trauma. It was just an ordeal, atrocity. And all I can say is I hope that the city of Palm Springs does justice for the Section 14 survivors and descendants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pearl. I think it's so important to note that, as Pearl said, her father built that home. This community was a working class community. Although Frank Bogart has a quote, he's quoted as saying, oh my God, what would happen, I'm paraphrasing, if Life magazine came to Palm Springs and they looked at the glitzy hotels that we're building, and then they looked across the street and they saw this community of black and brown people. Well, these black and brown people were the chefs, they were the cooks, they were the chauffeurs, they were the builders of this community. So as Lucille Ball and Frank Sinatra and Gene Autry and all these celebrities were moving into Palm Springs or vacationing in Palm Springs, it was the family members, it was the parents of these black people standing behind me, these Latino people standing behind me, who were supporting the lifestyle of these rich people, who were supporting the building and the foundation of Palm Springs. But if you drive through Palm Springs today, you don't see any evidence of the sweat, the tears, the sweat equity, the work that was done by these family members to build that community. And that is another reason that we are here today asking Palm Springs to step up and to acknowledge the harm done to these families and to acknowledge the significant contributions made by hundreds and hundreds of these families that live in Section 14. I next want to bring Delia Taylor to the microphone. She's also a survivor of Section 14.
Delia Taylor. I'm a Mexican woman who was born and raised on Section 14. My parents moved to Palm Springs from Santa Rita, New Mexico, with 4 children to make a better life for themselves. I have so many great memories of living there. Life on the reservation was so happy and carefree. We were poor, but didn't know it. We played outside until it was so dark we couldn't see in front of our faces. We were so united as a community at the time. We went to school with our neighborhood friends and went home with them. We played with them whenever we could. There was one little boy, excuse me, at my bus stop that I was so afraid of. My mom had to walk me to the bus stop and wait until I got on the bus. Every day he would come to me and stick his little bird chest out at me and say, if you don't marry me, I'm going to beat you up. I dreaded going to the bus stop and cried every day. Well, this little boy is now my husband, Alvin Taylor. His nickname is Boot. Every time my sisters wanted to make me cry, they would call me Boot. I'd start crying and go off and tell my mom, they're calling me Boot. I was going into 7th grade when our family was forced to move from the safe and secure life that I knew. My father worked hard and built our home, and we had to leave it behind. My childhood innocence, fun, and happy-going life was taken from me when we moved into a neighborhood that was filled with racism, hate, and anger. We were the 2nd or 3rd family, Mexican family, to move in there among the white families that were already living there. We were not accepted there because of our skin color. I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't know anything about racism or worrying about my skin color or talking Spanish. There was a family with 3 brothers whose house I had to walk by when I would walk to the local market. They would yell at me and call me wetback, and to go back to Mexico. I didn't even know where Mexico was. I would look straight ahead because I didn't want them to hurt me. One day when I was walking by their house, one of them shot me in the leg with a BB gun. I couldn't pretend like it didn't hurt and hit its target because the pop was so loud when it hit the jeans I had on that you couldn't miss the loud snap of the BB hitting my leg. I kept walking like it didn't hurt. I dreaded walking by their house and grew to hate those boys. Another time, my brother's car was set on fire in the middle of the night while the household was asleep. We all had to get up and go outside and put out the flames. I often wondered who it was that could be so mean to do something like that. It wasn't talked about at our house, at least not in front of me. There are so many other things that happened, but I won't get into that. Life went on and my anger grew for those that shunned me and avoided me because of my skin color and Mexican accent. Sadly, that anger was passed on to my kids and the following generations. We were disrupted and uprooted from our homes. Happiness turned to bitterness. My cousin Richard Godinez, also from Section 14, told me he saw our house get burned down and bulldozed. The thought of it just brings back so much anger, hurt, and pain. I'd like to come to a resolution. I would rather be happy than continue to be angry and bitter. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia.
Thanks, Delia. One of the things that we want to do is just acknowledge that the stories of Delia and Pearl are one of hundreds and hundreds of stories that I've had an opportunity to listen to, and they are all just incredibly heartbreaking to hear family members talk about coming home and seeing their houses bulldozed and seeing their houses set on fire. Again, because the city of Palm Springs decided that it was an easier and cheaper way to burn out these hundreds of families than to relocate them and to give them the respect and to treat them with the dignity that they deserve. Dr. Julianne Malvo is here. She is a part of the team that's been working with me and my law firm. She's done a preliminary harm assessment, because when we talk about what happened in Palm Springs, it's really important that we identify what the harm is. There's no dollar amount that we can put on what these families have endured and what they've lost in the 60 years since they were upended from their homes. But it is significant for the city and for all of us to have some sense of the magnitude of this loss. I'd like to bring Dr. Malvo to talk about what that preliminary harm assessment determined.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank Ariba for her work in organizing this. And I want to acknowledge the sisters who have shared their pain, Pearl and Dahlia. This is a central part of the reparations movement. It's not just dollars. You could hear harm as Dahlia spoke with tears about what happened. And so as we talk about reparations both globally, nationally, statewide, and locally, we have to talk about every aspect of it. If harm is done, harm must be fixed. It's not enough to have an apology. An apology is fine, but you can't put butter on an apology and make it edible. Economic harm was done to these families, and that's what we have to deal with. We've sat down and looked at the number of families who lived in Section 14, the number of houses that there were in Section 14, the present value of those homes, as well as their contents. People were simply burned out. They were not given the opportunity or notice to move. They were simply burned out. And so when we look at an economic formula, what I come up with is as much as $4 billion of harm. This is every family who was burned out, every family who lost all of their belongings. It's a modest number, frankly. We don't know how many families there were. We've looked at a map to estimate how many families there were. And we think that what the Attorney General did was an underestimate. After all, they came after people were burned out. And they did a lowball estimate. We're not mad at them. But what we want to say is now is the time to get it right. It's not just what happened in Section 14, it's what has happened around our nation. Attorney Martin mentioned Tulsa, Oklahoma. She mentioned Florida, but there are so many other stories. Wilmington, North Carolina, where over 600 people were burned out, where essentially the most prominent black men in that city were put on trains and bussed out of there so that they couldn't vote. And so while this is a yesterday's story, it's a today's story, and it's a tomorrow's story until Palm Springs fixes it. Now Palm Springs has the opportunity to do that. It has the opportunity to make history. It has the opportunity to acknowledge these families and to acknowledge their descendants and to come up with a number that compensates them, but not just a number. We also have to talk about the emotional and traumatic pain and talk about what will be done. Can there be a center built, a commemoration to these families and to their descendants? What other kinds of things can happen? What can be done about the emotional trauma? These are open questions, and I know that Attorney Martin and her team are more than capable of coming to the table, but what has to happen is Palm Springs has to come to the table. They have to be willing to say, this is what we have on the table, and then we have to be willing to negotiate with them. They can't just give us a number and say that's what it is. Then we have to talk to the people who have been affected to say, what satisfies you? An apology to me is like this. You apologize, but you acknowledge the harm, and then you say what you're gonna do about it. You don't just say, I'm sorry. That's what you say to somebody you bump up to in the bus station. I'm sorry, this is what I did wrong, this is how we fix it. Our estimate of how we fix it is up to $4 billion. Don't tell me that Palm Springs can't afford it. We're not asking for a lump sum right now. This could be done over a course of 5, 10, 20 years. But it must be done, there must be a commitment, there must be a possibility of reversing this harm. And while the reparations movement has basically been about harm to people of African descent, what we must also acknowledge is that so many others have been harmed by the predatory capitalism that allows people to extract surplus value from other people. In other words, had Palm Springs had good sense, they could have bought people out back then. They could have said, eminent domain, here's your check, move on. No, they find it more efficient to burn people out. So it's not just the money, it's also the trauma. Justice for the Section 14 people and their descendants. Justice for them now. Justice delayed is justice denied. And for all these years, justice has been denied. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malvo. Dr. Malvo didn't introduce herself, but you all know she's a noted economist. She's a dean at Cal State LA, and she is a leader in the reparations movement around this nation, has been studying reparations and ways that city can address and atone for its harms. So we're honored to have her as a part of this team. Next, we're going to bring State Senator Steve Bradford to the podium, because State Senator Bradford was a leader in the recovery of land in Manhattan Beach for the Bruce's family, and he's been a leader on the issues of reparations in the state of California. And we're honored to have Senator Bradford with us this morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Attorney Martin and Dr. Malvo for this opportunity to be here. But most importantly, the families, the survivors, the ones who experienced this trauma firsthand. I'm honored to be here to lend my voice, to lend the voice of the state, to lend the voice of an individual who has set and represented this state with the Reparations Task Force. But I don't want to conflate what happened to this family with reparations, because reparations was something promised and something owed. These folks had their homes stolen, they had their dignity stolen, they had the generational wealth stolen. This is about restoration. It's about returning what was stolen from them. If you steal my car today and you return it tomorrow, you haven't given me anything. You returned what was mine. And that's what happened with Bruce Beach. 100 years ago, the Bruce family acquired a piece of land to live the American dream and create economic wealth, just like these families did in Section 14. Only to have the government come in and use eminent domain there, not here, but there, to steal the property. It shouldn't be missed on any of us and lost on any of us that eminent domain and urban development only happens in black and brown communities. When's the last time you've seen a white community and they said we have urban renewal and redevelopment happening in those communities? It doesn't. We can point to hundreds, if not thousands, of examples. And what happened here in Section 14 shouldn't be unique to any of us, but only reason why it is because the stories haven't been told. There's thousands of stories. As stated, Greenwood, Africatown, let's say Allensworth. As I say, these stories are Bruce's Beach on steroids. Okay? If you're excited about Bruce's Beach, then we should be more committed and just outraged about what has happened to these families who had their whole towns destroyed. We can look at, again, Tulsa. We can look at so many places where African Americans tried to live the American dream only to have that snatched away by the government. I will give Palm Springs one bit of credit. They did apologize. Because as we stand here today, the city of Manhattan Beach has never apologized to the Bruce family and those 6 other families who had their properties taken. But as Dr. Malvo stated, apology is not enough. Now it's time to right the wrongs. And we as the state of California are committed to work with families such as the ones who are being impacted by Section 14, Bruce's Beach. We can also go up the road at Val Verde. We can go down the street to Sugar Hill. All of these were prominent African American communities. But let's also not miss the fact that Section 14 was also Native American land. And our Native American brothers and sisters, they also were victimized by much of what has happened in this country. So I'm here to say the state is watching, the state is committed. I'm looking forward to working with these families. I'm looking forward to working with Attorney Martin. And if there's legislation that is needed, if legislation is needed, I'm here standing ready to work with you. I chair the Legislative Black Caucus. The Legislative Black Caucus is committed to this issue as well. And again, we need to educate not only ourselves, but America of these atrocities. Because again, this is not unique, but we have an opportunity to correct the wrongs that have happened to these families and across this state and across this nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Bradford.
Thank you.
I need to make a brief correction. I said that it was between, whatever numbers I said were wrong. Economists do that sometimes, we conflate. So the amount of harm is 400 million to 2 billion. I gave you some different numbers, but it's 400 million to 2 billion, and that was calculated by looking at the present value of the homes that were lost, looking at the inflation rate, the rate of housing rising, and all of that. So just a brief numerical correction, and that's not the number that we're necessarily asking for. That's the number we come to the table with. And we're asking for Palm Springs to deal with us in good faith, given the range of the harm, and to come up with a number and a possibility for distribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malvo. Senator Bradford wants to make you attorney Malvo. So, Dr. Esquire Malvo. And thank you, Senator Bradford, for saying that you're standing with these families. That means everything to us to know that the state of California is standing with the survivors of Section 14 and the descendants. And we will definitely call on you if we need legislation. We're also honored this morning to have Assembly Person-elect Christy Halstead, because she was on the city council in the city of Palm Springs when that apology was issued. She's been a supporter of the survivors and descendants of Section 14. She was just recently elected to go to the California State Assembly. We are excited to have her as a champion for the families and descendants, and we know between her and Senator Bradford that we have both the House and the Senate covered if we do need legislation. So we'd like to bring Assembly Person-elect Christy Halstead to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me and including me in this conversation. And thank you to our Section 14 survivors for their bravery in speaking out and sharing their stories about the trauma they experienced at the hands of the government in the city of Palm Springs. I just want to recognize that I'm joined here by my colleague Jan Pye, council member for Desert Hot Springs. And our communities are connected because of this history of Section 14 and the forced displacement of the Black and Brown communities on Section 14, who were then pushed out of the city of Palm Springs, could not find housing because of racially restricted covenants, because of segregation and redlining and active discrimination. And so because of that, our region and this assembly district has a very vibrant Black community that connects Desert Hot Springs, Palm Springs, Banning, and Beaumont. As mayor for the city of Palm Springs in 2021, I'm proud that our city issued a formal apology for the forcible removal of the residents of Section 14. Those actions primarily impacted Black and Latino residents. Those actions were wrong then, they are wrong now. They created devastation and trauma in our communities and created different outcomes for Black and Latino residents that still exist today. It created segregation that still exists today. Our city's resolution stated today individuals and families who endured forced removals and clearances are still impacted by a legacy of racism, segregation, and a lack of resources. Before healing can begin for families and descendants of those removed, the city must acknowledge the hurt in our history and impact inflicted on Palm Springs residents. I want to take a moment to quote some of our residents and leaders in the community who've been leading on this issue. The City Council apologized because of the voices of the Section 14 survivors and their families and the activists in our community. Jarvis Crawford stated, when residents were pushed off Section 14, they were not given relocation assistance, they were not able to purchase land because they were Black. Not only that, but they were not able to secure a loan because they were Black. That robbed generations of our residents from achieving economic opportunity and equality that they deserved as residents of the city of Palm Springs and residents of California. Dieter Crawford, who's here today, stated, I believe that apologies are long overdue and should have been done years ago. An apology is just symbolic. I want to see reparations too. We lost generational wealth, and not just from our residential homes, but from our institutions, like the First Baptist Church, which was first located on Section 14, and then rebuilt by the community. When I was first elected 5 years ago to the Palm Springs City Council, Dieter Crawford, grandson of Cora Crawford, a Section 14 survivor and beloved community leader who fought for equity and justice for our community for decades, took me on a tour and showed me the real lived experiences and the differences in that area of town in Desert Highlands from other areas of town. I was shocked to see the segregation and the disparate impacts. I worked for 10 years as a civil rights attorney. I've worked in East Palo Alto and Palo Alto. I've worked all over the state. I've worked in Thermal and Mecca and Palm Springs. I've never quite seen active and ongoing segregation like I've seen in Palm Springs. Thank you to Dieter for continuing to educate council members. I just want to take a moment to also identify the power and strength and resilience of our residents, the Section 14 survivors, and this work belongs to them, and thank you to them for speaking out despite the personal cost of reliving trauma after trauma after trauma. We know that is difficult for you, and we appreciate your voices in sharing the true history of Palm Springs and the true history of California. Desert Highlands is now one of the strongest and most powerful communities in the city of Palm Springs because of a history of fighting injustices for decades, and because of all they've accomplished despite discrimination and oppression. They've successfully advocated for mobile food banks and pantries to address food deserts and lack of investment by the city. They've successfully advocated for a Loma Linda Medical Center community health survey to identify and track that disparate impacts and outcomes facing the Black and Latino communities in Palm Springs. And they successfully established and funded a mobile health clinic with our healthcare district to address those challenges. Today, I'm incredibly proud to represent this many Section 14 survivors as a Palm Springs City Council member and hopefully a California State Assembly member. We're still waiting on our final results. I'm grateful that they've spoken out and continue to share those stories. We believe that with their leadership, the city of Palm Springs could be one of the very first successful reparations programs in the state, if not the country. Since the apology, we have removed the statue of Frank Bogert, the mayor at the time, who was heavily personally involved in Section 14 actions. We've removed that statue from City Hall. We've started a request for proposal process to begin the process to implement a first in the state reparations program. We've worked with the survivors group, but we know much more work is yet to be done because we've only yet done an apology and you have not seen the real consequences of those wrong actions. Thank you to the attorneys and Ariva Martin for elevating this issue. Sometimes what happens in Palm Springs might not be elevated to the statewide level, and our community has lived with these realities for over 60 years. And it's about time we talk about this issue as a state, because we are one small community. Palm Springs has 48,000 residents, but this is the atrocious history of so many of our communities. Thank you to Senator Bradford for shining a light on our communities and our survivors and our district and your leadership statewide. The city of Palm Springs remains committed to addressing and undoing the systemic injustices that occurred in Section 14 neighborhoods decades ago. The city has taken and will continue to take the steps necessary to address those injustices, support our communities, support our survivors, atone for these actions, and to ensure that these atrocities never happen again anywhere in this state or in this country. As a community and a region, we're dedicated to ending racial and social disparities, strengthening the way we engage to protect and expand community voice and power, and we're committed to closing the gap of racial injustice and better serve the city's communities of color. If elected as a state assembly member, I'm committed to the work with Senator Bradford to also pursue budget requests and state legislation if needed to make sure this work gets done. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much. We're confident, Christy, that when those numbers are counted, you're going to be the next Assemblywoman for Palm Springs. We need you in the Assembly, and we appreciate your support. I want to just acknowledge some of our community leaders. Michael Lawson is here. He's Executive Director of Urban League. Robert Salcido is here. He's Executive Director of Community Build. I think Pastor Smart is here, or was here. He's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Najee Ali is here. He's a longtime community activist in this community, and so many other folks who've come out to show their support for these survivors. I just want to give the survivors and descendants a big round of applause because Christy talked about their courage, and it does take courage to come forth and to tell this story. This has been a Palm Springs story, but after today, we hope that this is the story that all of California is talking about and all of the nation is talking about, because these families deserve to have their stories amplified. They deserve to have an opportunity to tell their stories, and they deserve the support of not only Palm Springs, but the state of California and the United States. So thank you again so much for joining us, and some of our survivors will stick around if anyone wants to do interviews. I have questions for our survivors. But again, thanks to the community and thanks to everyone for standing with the families of Palm Springs, with the survivors and the descendants, and demanding justice for these families.
Can we get them
Justice for who? Section 14. Justice for who?
Section 14!
Justice for who?
Section 14!
Justice for who?
Section 14!
All right.
All right. All right.